Hello class and welcome to week 7 of CLS 100. This week we continue with our look at different aspects of academic success by shifting from reading and note-taking, which we talked about last week, to studying and memory. So over the course of this mini lecture and week you should gain a better understanding of memory, learn some techniques for improving memory, and learn some strategies for studying. So we'll begin with a little bit of basic information about memory. First of all, everyone remembers and forgets information. And second of all, not all memory is the same. So when we talk about someone having a good memory or a bad memory, in some respects that's a little bit of an inaccurate statement because all of us remember some things and forget other things, and all of us have 3 different types of memory that are all used for different things. The first type of memory is sensory memory. Sensory memory usually only lasts 1 to 3 seconds, and it's the memory that stores information that's gathered from your 5 senses. The second type of memory is short-term memory. Short-term memory can only hold around 5 to 9 pieces of information at a time. It's also known as working memory because it stores information that we need for sort of the short term to accomplish tasks that we might be working on right now. And then finally, long-term memory has a large capacity and functions like a computer hard drive. In other words, in your long-term memory, this is where you store the things that you hear, see, or use often. But the thing that's important about long-term memory is it can store virtually anything with effort. And one of the things that you'll see as we go through this mini lecture is, just like so many of the other weeks in this course, the things we're talking about really require conscious effort and intentionality. And memory is no different. It's no different than reading. It's no different than studying. It's no different than taking notes. If you make a conscious effort to remember things and to improve your memory, then you can get better at remembering things. And the key, really, is retrieval. So once you store the information, the big thing is learning how to get the information back out. And that's one of the things that we'll focus on as we go through this mini lecture. Okay, so the first sort of practical thing that we'll talk about in this mini lecture is a memory technique called VCR3, not to be confused with SQ3R. So VCR3 is one technique for building memory. And essentially it's made up of 5 parts. So the first one, the V, is visualizing. Visualizing means creating word pictures as you read or listen. Especially if you're a visual learner, having concrete visual images in your mind associated with particular things will help you recall them later. Again, the key is retrieval. So how do you recall things? The C stands for concentrating, and concentrating simply means staying focused. It's very difficult to commit things to long-term memory and to get them back out when you don't really concentrate on that information. With the 3 R's, the first of those is relating. Relating involves relating the information that you're trying to memorize to something that you already know. So in other words, you take something that you already know is committed to long-term memory and that you have retrieval strategies for, and you tag the new thing onto that. The second R stands for repeating. Repeating and the final one, reviewing, both refer to essentially the same thing. We know that one of the strongest aids to memory is repeating and reviewing information. And so when you repeat things, for example, if you're studying, if you repeat things, it helps commit them to memory. So that's one technique for improving your memory. The next thing that we'll talk about is memorizing versus owning information. And I know that this may seem repetitive, but much like we talked about with reading and taking notes last week, your attitude toward memory makes a big difference at how well you remember things. And so in your textbook, they talk about the difference between memorizing information versus owning it. So memorizing is basically something that's sort of short-lived. So if I'm taking a test and I simply try to remember the information long enough to get past the test, that's memorizing. Owning, on the other hand, is where you make a commitment to truly understand the information and make it a part of your life. And if you do take ownership of that information, you're a lot more likely to retain it. So, again, with the right attitude, an ownership type attitude toward material, your chances of memorizing things are much higher. Okay, so now we'll actually move into some specific devices to help you memorize things. And I'm not sure if you've heard this term before. You may have seen this term before, but maybe you didn't realize what it meant. The term is mnemonics. And basically what mnemonics are is they're memory techniques or tricks that assist you in putting things into and retrieving them from your long-term memory. And we'll talk about several different types of mnemonics. And as we talk about these, what I want you to do is I want you to think about how you might be able to use these mnemonics in your studying or in your reading or along with your note-taking to help you remember the information for your classes more effectively. So the first one's jingles or rhymes. An example of this would be Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So you have a basic fact about history, and it makes it easier to remember if you find some way to put that into a sentence that rhymes. The rhyming is easier to remember than actually memorizing the pure facts. Second will be using sentences. And this is where you create sentences where the first letters of the words are the first letters of the items you need to learn. So for example, my very elderly mother just saved us nicely is something that can be used as a mnemonic device for remembering the planets. So you have MVEMJSUN, or Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. The next one's very similar, and that's the use of words. So for example, and some of you may have heard this when you were in elementary school, Roy G. Biv is a memory device for remembering the colors of the rainbow. It's easy to remember Roy G. Biv. It's easier to remember that than it is to remember red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. The final one on this slide is storylines. It's easier to remember a story than it is to remember a bunch of facts. So if you can create a story that integrates the facts you need to remember, it can make the memorization of those facts go more smoothly. Okay, two more mnemonics that we'll talk about. And the first is acronyms. So for example, and you may not even have known this, that SCUBA, as in scuba diving or scuba gear, is actually an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. One thing that's interesting as a professor is I've seen over the years the way that students use some of these mnemonic devices on their tests. Because one of the things that students will do, and maybe you've done this as well, is you memorize the acronyms or you memorize the sentences or the words, and the first thing you do when you get your exam is you write those things in the margins. And so I can't even tell you how many times I've got tests that have been turned in with various acronyms or various sentences or various sort of mnemonic devices written down in the margins that people have used to remember things. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, that's something I would encourage you to do in your classes with written exams. And the final mnemonic device is what we call pegging. This is a little bit complicated, and so I would encourage you to read pages 244 to 245 in your textbook to really understand it. But the basic idea is that you create a series of what they call pegs in your mind, one set of pegs that you memorize once. And so those pegs are typically just some list of 10 or so words that, again, you memorize once. And then what you do is when you need to remember other information later, you create sentences that attach the new information to the pegs that you already have memorized. Again, read pages 244 and 245 in your textbook for more information. And the key, the last thing on this PowerPoint slide, is the key is find a system that fits your learning style and your personality, find something that works for you and stick with it. I can tell you from personal experience that when I was studying for exams and when I was taking notes, I kind of used those two things together. So I was very much an outline note taker. I would take these linear outline notes, and then when I was studying for exams, I would create lists of information to help me memorize all the information for the test. And I would go through those lists over and over again and just repeat it. So I used the repetition and I used the organized lists, and that would help me commit the information to memory. And that's not something that works for everyone, but it's something that I found worked for me. Okay. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to some information about studying and some more concrete study techniques and tips. So we've talked about memory. Now we'll move on to studying, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about test taking. And the first thing I want to talk to you about when it comes to studying is cramming. And the simple piece of advice here is don't cram. Cramming hinders your ability to truly own the material. You may know it for a short period, but then it disappears. And so if you find that you're constantly cramming, that you're up till 5 in the morning the night before, trying to get all the information committed to memory so you can take a test at 10 the next morning, here are some things that you can do to combat that. First of all, study each day to avoid last-minute stress. In other words, plan ahead, try to learn the information in small bits as you go, rather than cramming it all in one large session. Second, form a study group with other motivated students. In other words, bring other people in, study with them, keeps you accountable, spreads out the study time. And finally, keep up with your daily reading and homework. Don't let yourself get into a situation where you have 65 pages of reading to do the night before an exam. Try to space things out. Don't procrastinate, which is something we talked about in the past couple of weeks. But I understand that there are times when you have to cram. Life can be complicated. You're juggling a lot of different things. And so when you must cram, here are some basic tips to help you do it effectively. First of all, depressurize. So accept the fact that you're only memorizing it for a short term and don't beat yourself up trying to own the material. Second, ditch the blame game. Accept that you waited until the last minute and just commit to not doing it the next time. If you spend a bunch of time sitting around being upset with yourself, all it's doing is taking time away from studying. Third, know the score, which means prepping for the type of test you'll have. There's a certain amount of strategy that goes into studying. If you know you have a multiple choice test, study the kind of information that you would see on a multiple choice test. You don't study the same way for a multiple choice test that you would for an essay test. You just don't have to know the information in the same way. So be smart about it. Next, make connections. So as you're going through chapters and readings and your notes, look for information that may be linked to particular test questions. So if you know there are going to be compare and contrast questions on a test, look for the kinds of stuff that would lend itself to those kinds of questions. Again, strategic studying. Next, use your syllabus and study guide. Oftentimes the instructor is going to give you clues to what's important, so use that information. The next one is see it. So if you're a visual learner especially, use visualization techniques like mapping to commit the information to your short-term memory. Next is checking your notes. Did your instructor highlight particular things to know for the test? If so, you should probably know them. And finally, choose wisely. You can't do everything. You can't study everything. So be smart. Know the most important information and prioritize. Okay, another study technique you can use is study groups. So if you're someone that learns well in group settings and you're more of a collaborative learner, study groups have lots of advantages. They allow you to share information, listen to others, ask questions, brainstorm, solve problems, and develop a support system. And on this slide, you'll see some basic tips for study groups. They're all pretty self-explanatory, so I don't want to spend a lot of time talking to them. But to kind of hit some of the high points, you want to make sure that your study group is a manageable size, so 3 to 5 people. You want everyone to make a personal commitment to kind of bringing their best every time. You want people in the group that have similar schedules so that you can actually get people together. And you want to try to limit your meetings to 2 to 3 hours and make sure that you have sort of concrete objectives and goals. Those are just some basic things to make your study group time more effective. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about then is tests. I don't know about you, but I know that a lot of people have test anxiety. Maybe you're one of those people that has test anxiety. And if you look in your textbook, there are a number of different tips for dealing with test anxiety. And in fact, one of the activities I gave you for this week involves brainstorming some ways to control test anxiety. Here are some basic things that you can do to try to reduce it. So control negative self-talk. If you constantly are telling yourself, I'm not going to do well, you're probably going to be right. Second, study daily and overlearn the material. In other words, be as prepared as you can. Third, arrive early and prepared for the test. It's always even more stressful when you run in at the last minute and you're scrambling to try to get your things out. Make sure you get there in time to settle in. Next, jot down your mnemonics right away, which is something I talked about earlier. Read your instructions and the entire test carefully and answer the questions you know first. If you do those things, it can kind of help build some confidence, which will carry through for the rest of the test. Finally, when you're going into a test, this slide really just simply gives you more concrete tips for being strategic about studying. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on this. I've talked about several of these already. But the key thing here is you need to be smart and strategic when you study. Think about the size of the test. How many questions is it? Is there a time limit? Is there a study sheet? What's the grading value of it? What sections will be covered? Just be smart. Think about if this is the way the test is going to be written, what's likely to be on there, and how do I need to study that information to be able to reiterate it or bring it back up in that particular form. Okay, this next slide lists some common question types, and these are just sort of up as kind of a reminder to you to go check your textbook for specific strategies for these types of questions. Your book has 3 or 4 entire pages of concrete strategies for every single one of these types of questions. Matching, true-false, multiple choice, short answer, and essay questions. So if there are particular types of questions that you're weak in, use your textbook and try to find some strategies that you can employ on your next exam to perform better. Okay, so to wrap things up, some reflections on this chapter. First of all, if we kind of think about studying, you want to study the hardest material first. The easy material comes easier, so make sure that you allow yourself more time for the most difficult material. Review your lecture and textbook notes frequently. Use mnemonics plus a variety of other techniques. Also be test-wise. In other words, know the test details in advance. Be strategic with your studying. When you sit down for a test, review the entire test before starting. Give yourself a sense of what you're dealing with and then plan accordingly. Also, some things we didn't talk about, but I want to talk about here at the end. When you're taking a test, ignore the pace of your classmates. It doesn't matter who turns their exam in first or when they get done. Everyone works differently, and you don't even know that that person got any questions right. You focus on your work and be aware of your time while testing. The worst thing that can happen is you get hung up on 1 or 2 questions and you don't move past that and you end up turning in a test full of blank questions that you knew the answers to. So pay attention to your time. That's it for week 7. I will see you next week in week 8.